Thank you, Madan and Extensia and participants today. This will be more a discussion, and we would like to include the audience as well, right? It's not going to be a one-way between us. Rather, it's more of a discussion among all of us. In the past few years, the affordability or the price of devices in Africa has reduced, obviously. There are a couple efforts in Africa to assemble, mobile devices. There is one in Ethiopia and others as well. That did help in reducing the price of the device. However, it is still high for many in Africa. I would say Africa is liquid cash constrained. I wouldn't say Africa is resource constrained, right? We have the resource, the human capital, and everything within Africa. However, we have a constraint of liquid cash. Therefore, importing devices from the West or Asia is expensive. Along those lines, governments are making an effort to ensure devices are affordable for Africa. However, more work is needed. So along those lines, we will have a few questions with Meta here. First, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself, and we have a few discussion points to go over.
Thanks, and I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I'm Desmond Mushi. I am a Tanzanian from Kilimanjaro, but I live in Dar es Salaam, currently working for Meta. And if you do not already know, Meta is the company that was formerly known as Facebook, and it's the company that owns WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, Facebook, as well as most recently Threads. And my role as a public policy manager is to really serve as an ambassador of our region, which is Eastern Horn of Africa, to the company that is Meta, to make sure that Meta realizes the opportunities, but also is aware of the challenges of use of our platforms from our region, but also to bring to the region some of the opportunities that Meta has to offer in the work that we do. And the work is beyond. I think there's a lot of work that Meta does on infrastructure, such as To Africa as well, on mobile partnerships, even to reduce costs of devices and others, beyond the usual social media work that you are aware of, like verification and things like that. So that's me, and really thrilled to be here as well.
Thank you. Based on Meta's involvement in Africa in the past few year,s how are digital services, are they affordable, digital services to on-ramp to the digital highway, right? You need devices, you need applications, you need connectivity, data storage units. How is that? Is it being affordable, and what are the efforts that Meta is doing to ensure its services are affordable for the community?
Thank you so much. So just to answer that question really briefly, when you compare over time, the past 5 years and what is the case now, there's been a lot of change. At Meta, we work with the economists. There is one study that we usually do. It's usually live. It's called 3I, which is Inclusive Internet Index. And really what it hopes to do, what we intend to do with it, is to use locally available data from, say, World Bank or National Bureaus of Statistics to really just give an index of what it feels like to operate in the ICT space. So whether it's availability, affordability, readiness of users, as well as relevance, how people feel that these platforms are relevant for them. That's what it tries to do. And over time, in most cases, most countries have improved. What I would say on affordability of devices is that because of, aspects such as budgeting, being able to budget and pay for a device over time, reduce cost of devices, and different people bringing in devices, there's been a change in making these devices more affordable. But what we are seeing is mostly the entry-level devices. I think with higher features, more advanced features, still for most people these are not accessible for them. That's the first thing that I would say. And beyond that is that even from an infrastructure perspective, there's a lot of things that are available, that are accessible, but they're not used for a number of reasons. And I think the biggest ones, whilst most people might think it's about affordability and availability, is really the aspect of readiness and relevance, which is, I think, an aspect that most people have forgotten, and we are glad to see that a lot of governments are really working to address those two areas. So to answer that question, there's been a huge marked improvement over time. I think initiatives such as the one in Ethiopia, I think there was a similar one, a similar initiative in DRC. We see now Safaricom in Kenya trying to have locally manufactured devices and have them accessible to so those initiatives really do help. In Tanzania, I think in the past 2 years, I think 2 years ago, there was an initiative to address this from a fiscal perspective. So removing import duties associated with smartphones, but I think that didn't also yield the intended results. So there's also different things that different countries are trying, either from the fiscal space or from supporting local manufacturing. And so the more use cases we have, the higher the chance that we'll land at the right place. So it's a space that we are also working on. So within Meta, our mobile partnership teams are working very closely with mobile network operators across the region. So we have pilot programs in Rwanda and in Kenya now to try and see what really can be done from a research perspective to try and reduce the cost or increase usage of smartphones in the region. So if those pilots, the insights that we'll get from those pilots, hopefully we can share next year, so that also other governments can see what it is that they can actually do to increase usage of smartphone devices.
Thank you. Just to follow up along the same thought line, you had mentioned that devices being used in Africa are more basic and functional. However, Meta, I would think, is focused around AR and augmenting reality as well as virtual reality. What are the opportunities for this emerging technologies in Africa?
Yes. And really this goes to the crux of why the name was changed from Facebook, which is one of the platforms that Meta owns, to Meta. And just to answer your question, a little bit of background, 50 years ago, if you wanted to interact with a computer, you would have to do it in a mainframe computing center. You'd go to a place and interact with it. I think, from the 1980s, computers became more personal. So you had a desktop computer. Then we moved from a personal computer to a more portable computer, in the 2000s, the laptops, then to mobile computing, which you can have on your phone and things like that. And it's not just the devices that have changed, it's the content. Before, you'd go to a place and you'd interact with Wikipedia. Content was there for you to consume. Now we're in an age where everybody is both a consumer and a creator of content. If you think about the Swahili social media platform like Jamii Forums, to social media platforms that Meta owns, and others, it's really an interactive process as opposed to you being there and consuming. And it's not just the content and the agents that has changed, it's actually the nature of content. A lot of it before was text. What we are seeing now is a lot of content is moving to audio visual, so audio content and visual content. And really that's where we see ourselves, that's where we see the future of technology being the metaverse. More immersive experiences where you can be in Zanzibar from your comfort of DC or Addis Ababa, I don't know, Timbuktu. I'm trying to think of fun places to be. And that's where we see the technology is going. But from a Meta perspective, to just give you a number of use cases for XR, which is augmented and virtual reality, I'll maybe highlight two. Growing up in Tanzania, so as I said, I'm a Tanzanian, if you wanted to study sciences, in most cases, if your school was a very good school, you had a laboratory. If you didn't have a laboratory, we did what we called alternative to practical, which is really reenacting what that practical would have resulted to, but from memory, as opposed to actually doing the practical itself. With virtual reality, you can actually have a lab that a lot of students can actually go and take part in without necessarily having a physical laboratory. So there's a lot of use cases in education, and there's piloting of university campuses in the United States, historical black colleges in the United States. They've actually put their colleges within the VR device, so you can actually go to that school without necessarily being physically there. So that's in education. The other area that I think is really, really cool is in workforce, especially in areas such as mining, healthcare, for example. You can think of use cases where there is low frequency but high stake scenarios. You can't have emergency trauma cases reenacted so many times. So because of that, you can actually go through those experiences. You can almost create that reality in a virtual setup and have people learn as many times as they need to without necessarily having the real life consequences of having gone through those experiences. So in sectors such as mining, I think in healthcare, we see a lot of use cases. Even in aviation, as a pilot, you can learn how to do most of these things without necessarily having to try out with the very few Air Tanzanians that we have, So that's the way that you can think about it. But those are the two key areas that I would personally highlight.
Thank you. I think I would agree in terms of opportunities, and there are use cases around education, health, and remote operation. However, it goes back to affordability in terms of you would need a high bandwidth for some of that connectivity. With that comes the price and affordability. However, for schools, universities, perhaps you can set up a lab. It might be affordable. However, for commercial, for the public, I still believe the price is prohibitive. Thanks for mentioning those use cases. Now, switching gears here. In terms of meta services, mainly the social network and its impact on mental health in terms of being addictive. I don't want to put you on the spot as representing the industry. However, it is something that we in Africa need to learn from the first movers. I call that second movers advantage, which is you learn the mistakes of the first mover so that we don't repeat. So any effort within your organization to ensure the products and services that we provide to the consumers is healthy and useful.
Yes, I was hoping the mic wouldn't work for this very question, but there's a number of things. I think the first is working with local stakeholders. We work with government. I think Mkurugenzi yuko hapa, I would attest to that. Regulators across the region, but also with CSO partners to understand the real life impact of social media platforms in various countries. I think when I was introducing myself, the first thing that I said is we're ambassadors. We go to Meta, we go to the company and say, actually from an experience of a South Sudanese or a Tanzanian or Ugandan, these are the real life implications of these platforms the way they are now. And these are some of the areas or things that we need to change to make sure that they are healthy for usage. So whether from an integrity perspective, really it's understanding what those impacts could look like, and that we do through working with governments as well as non-state actors like CSOs and others to really understand the implications and impacts of our platforms, but also addressing those things as they come. I think there's a difference between one that you mentioned is well-being, especially amongst the youth. That's about time spent and things like that. So there's a lot of product level innovations to ensure that young people know how much time they spend and they can regulate it themselves. So a lot of this is really on an individual to be able to manage. There's areas around child safety as well, and the control that parents have on what their children can see, what they cannot see, who can befriend them, and if at all anyone. So there's a lot of things that are actually within reach. I think the part that we keep on hearing is that a lot of these product level features that are enabled by Meta platforms aren't not necessarily accessible, but a lot of people aren't aware about them. So it's really how can we build mass awareness of integrity features that happen to be on our platforms. It's not just about safety, it's about privacy as well. What you can choose to share with others, what you can choose to share with Meta as well, is really within your fingertips. But a lot of people do not know about these things. So a lot of work that we are doing going forward is really to ensure that we create awareness about these safety features that exist on our platforms, but also take stock of the gaps that exist. And I'll give you a few. There's ways in which some of these products are developed, and the perception we have sometimes does not mirror realities on the ground. So, for example, when there is misinformation, on our platforms, we tend to have the inform feature, the inform feature that has you click on it and it tells you this has been marked as misinforming. And we realize that from most countries in our region, that doesn't really address the issue. Someone doesn't feel misinformed right away. They actually feel you are scamming them. So there's some of those gaps we need to understand so that we don't have blanket policies across the world, but the policies that actually mirror realities on the ground as well.
I'm glad the mic worked. Thank you. That was a good answer. Along the same line, in terms of content moderation, content that gets displayed or hosted on those platforms. As you know, Africa is 54 plus countries, and there are nuanced differences in terms of culture, regulatory framework. Do you have a plan to ensure content is moderated for local context in each countries?
Yes. So I think there is yes and no to that answer. The yes bit is that a lot of decisions are made with local context. So the people who review some of this content that has been reported to us, either through regulators, through CSOs, or through users in-app, a lot of the people who review content in a particular country tend to be people who understand the language, who understand the context, and are from that particular country. So that's the part that a lot of people do not know. And this is especially true for countries where we have high-risk scenarios, whether there is an ongoing conflict or something like that. So that's the part that I would say the laws are translated, and the issue that we always try and understand is the potential for harm is translated from one country to another, and that might differ from one country to another. Even some words, maybe because I'm in Tanzania, I can tell you words like baharia have meant very different things over a very long period of time. And it takes someone who understands the Tanzania context to say, this word, the way it is used today, is harmful, whilst the way it was used 2 years ago was benign. So that part is true. The other part that I would say that is, the no part is that these community standards, the standards that govern what stays and doesn't stay on our platforms, are global. And you can appreciate that because, Instagram is a global platform. So Mkurugenzi here posting, what they are posting must be accessible all over the world. So how can you confine yourself to one particular rule or law over another? It becomes very, very difficult. If it's unlawful in Tanzania, is it lawful in Kenya? Or if it's unlawful in Uganda, does it mean it shouldn't be shown so that part becomes very difficult. What we tend to do is to have global standards, and the process of developing the global standards, global community standards, is actually very inclusive. I'll tell you one example. When we were discussing, so we used to have a bullying and harassment policy, which was really good at protecting individuals like myself who are not famous, but not necessarily very protective of individuals that have high-ranking position or that are notable in their communities. But those were reviewed and updated because of insights from Tanzania. And this happened during COVID-19. There's a lot, the questions around, if I'm a public figure, must my filing really be impacted? When do I stop being a public figure? When I've died, am I still a public? So there's a lot of things that actually, a lot of those nuances that went into reviewing that policy and improving it came from local countries. At the moment, we are actually discussing another policy around unstructured health commodities. So someone saying, I ate so and so and lost weight and things like that. How do you regulate around that? Because the regulations differ from one country to another. What those products look like differ from one country to another. So that process is extremely inclusive. We talk with government, we talk with non-state actors. They give us insights that are consistent with their local realities, and we try find a line of best fit. Granted, sometimes it will fit others more than others, but that is really the difficulty of developing a global platform, and we appreciate that, and I hope you can appreciate the challenges that we endure as well.
Thank you. The final question I have is, in terms of devices and digital services affordability in Africa, should the government subsidize? In some countries, fuel is subsidized for example, in Ethiopia, the government subsidizes fuel. In some countries, internet connectivity is subsidized. Is it should the government subsidize these digital services because they are imperative for economic development, or should the MNOs or network service providers subsidize devices? I would say, my opinion here, iPhone was not, iPhone was successful because they came up with the financial engineering, I would call, spreading the payment across 24 months for 2 years. Otherwise, nobody would have bought iPhone when it came out. Touch screen was not revolutionary at the time. We had touch screen, we had small phones as well. The success came from ensuring it was accessible and affordable, spreading the payment across 2 years. That's the main reason. I think we that gets lost on the iPhone success. Is there an effort from Meta to subsidize devices so that they are affordable?
So currently, I think it's the research work that's ongoing. We are supporting that research work. That's the one thing that I would say on subsidization of. For me personally, I actually think the relevance and readiness issue is the key one. I think there's a lot of people who can afford smartphone devices but aren't doing that simply because they don't see what is on those platforms as relevant for them or aren't ready to meaningfully utilize them. So to actually answer that question, I think if we can address that, so that's about skills development, upskilling people. It's about ensuring that these platforms are relevant for sectors such as tourism and agriculture, which are really, really key in our markets and things like that, that we can actually get people to see the value to access. And the last bit, as you said, is about being able to pay over a longer period of time, but that becomes a little bit difficult when it's complicated to authenticate who I am in a particular country. So initiatives around having a single national identification number are really, really key, because then you can be sure that this person can be traced. Otherwise, I can easily go to one of the mobile network operators, get a device, and then disappear. So there's a number of initiatives that put together in the next couple of years would make a number of things possible to address readiness, to address issues around relevance, but also to make it possible to pay over a specific period of time, say 2-3 years, which then would mean a lot of people can have smartphones that have more advanced features than the basic ones that we see in the market.
Thank you. Open it up.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. We can take a couple of, yes, I see. Oh, wow, lots of questions. Let's take the questions back to back.
Great. Thank you very much. So a question for you, obviously, in terms of Meta. Cambridge Analytica happened. 2 elections were affected by the work that was done by Cambridge on the Meta networks. What are you doing to prevent that from happening in East Africa? You're talking about protecting public figures, but what about protecting the populace from manipulation, from untrustworthy players in the market?
So the first thing that I would say is that the bullying and harassment policy actually protects we the users, the commoners. I consider myself a commoner, than it does public figures. It's just that what I was trying to refer to is there's more protection now for public figures than there was before. And to answer that question, yes, we learned from that experience of Cambridge Analytica and places where it affected. And there's a number of things that we are doing differently. The first and maybe the biggest one is that during an election season, it is impossible to run an ad in a country. So if Tanzania is holding an election next year, I think the local government election, someone from outside of Tanzania cannot run ads in Tanzania. So that in itself is a huge, I think Cambridge Analytica happened because a lot of people are able to influence developments in different location from their comfort of another location. So someone from whatever country, Sorry? So that's the first part. So no, I'm saying that's the first part. The second bit is that during an election, if any election-related ads, so if it's a civic content ad, it needs to say who is funding those ads. And that also is in a library where you can actually go for 7 years after the election has passed to see who ran ads in Zanzibar during the 2020 election and how much did they spend, what was their target. So there's a lot more information that is accessible to people, even for researchers, during and after an election. So that's, in a way, then can affect who can and cannot see ads.
Good morning, fellow panelists and delegates. My question goes to connectivity, connecting the unconnected. So Meta had the express Wi-Fi, which was very helpful, connecting the areas that are remote, connecting the unconnected, affordable connectivity to the less remote people. So this ceased for, I think, 2 years now. What's the plan for Meta to ensure the connected are connected, and what do you have in store ahead?
Yes, so it is true that that program was deprecated, but there's other ways in which we are working to ensure meaningful connectivity around the world. I think at the moment, what I can say is that there's a lot of initiatives that we are doing with working with ISOC at global level, but also ISOC at regional level, to try and see what those opportunities would look like in areas around internet exchange points, caches, and others. And those are actually true for a lot of countries in Africa. And the other bit is working with mobile network operators as well to try and do exactly that. So not necessarily that we've stopped working on connecting the unconnected, we've just changed strategy. And as I say, there's a lot of pilot work that's ongoing that will also inform future connectivity-related investments as well.
Great, thanks. So I think there was recognition from Meta that connectivity is important, hence the Express Wi-Fi initiative. Since then, my question is that Meta benefits from infrastructure investments that are made through private sector as well as government. Is there any future intention for Meta to contribute towards universal service and access funds? And I ask this because there's also a taxation gap that exists right now between mobile operators and big tech that also benefits from doing business in the continent. And lastly, the issue around content economy. What are the investments that Meta is making in Africa specifically? Not only for use, but to develop app developers, for example. Because I think ultimately it's great that we are on these platforms as consumers and using our own content. But at some point we need to think about the content economy itself. How are we positioning Africans beyond just consumption online, but to actually be able to create the kind of apps that generate revenue on platforms like Facebook as well as Instagram and maybe Thread? Thank you.
Very, very difficult questions. So on the first question, what I would say is that a lot of Meta investments in infrastructure isn't usually accounted or reflected on Meta's part. So Tour Africa is a good example, and it was launched, I think, landed and was launched in Tanzania by Her Excellency the President. So there's a lot of investment that's happening already on the infrastructure side, I think, especially subsea cable related investments, and that is 45,000 kilometers touching on 33 countries and 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. So there's a lot of work that's ongoing there on whether or not we will be contributing to the Universal Communication Services Access Fund. I am not at liberty, but if I answer that question, I might not be around to see that through. So I'll maybe wait, and maybe that's, and to tell you the truth as well, at Meta, these are ongoing conversations. Our position on matters like this change, as is clearly evident on VAT on ads, for example, taxation and things like that. So that is the part that we will try, and it's not just Sub-Saharan Africa that's calling upon that, is also other regions that are asking that question. The second question is a little bit different on ensuring that, and that's the part that I was trying to get to when I talked about readiness and relevance, that the content we consume in Africa isn't, content from other parts, but also we are content producers and see value in the content that we produce. So there's a lot of work that's ongoing, whether in the XR space, supporting, extra innovators across the region, from Tanzania to really strong ones in South Africa, as well as Nigeria and Kenya, to, supporting creators that are currently using Instagram, especially Instagram and Facebook platforms for their work, to get monetization. And so there's pilots that are going to be tried in countries like Kenya, because at the moment monetization is only accessible for countries like South Africa in Africa. And so we are trying to figure out ways to ensure that if that happens, then there's a lot of content creators that will see value, more meaningful value, and from Meta, because they see value, that's why they're using the platforms, but from Meta's perspective going forward. So there's a lot of ongoing initiatives. Cannot say that this is a fix to the issues that you have, but I really take note of the comment on readiness and relevance, and from that perspective, ensuring that the content is content that I am most responsive to, because it's produced locally as well.
Thanks, Desmond, for taking those very tough questions. Naoll, would you like to sum up in a minute or so?
Yes. Thank you for taking the time and taking the hard, difficult, relevant questions and being gracious to respond. But I will just summarize. We understand that Meta, Google, and others, right? Global, multinational organizations are circling Africa. But we need to understand their businesses, right? Their primary motive is market and business and being profitable. It is regulatory framework to ensure the services and the content we consume are useful and solve an existing problem rather than creating a market. So from government policy, that's where protection to the population and the consumers, right? Consumer protection should come from primarily from government. Otherwise, platform providers are businesses, and that their intention is to be profitable. We have to balance that. Thank you.
Thanks, Naoll. Thanks, Naoll, once again, and Desmond, for a fantastic session. Both will be around.